What happens when you speak with two leaders in the field of educational technology? You learn a lot. We were fortunate to speak with Dan Taylor and John Mikton, who, in their spare time, host the big dog of international education podcasting, the International Schools Podcast. We asked them the guiding question, what does technology use in teaching and learning look like post-pandemic, and what might it look like going forward? John and Dan responded with so many helpful insights. Here are a few. The pandemic was an example of the power of disruption to bring about change and innovation. A focus on well-being has emerged. We have the technology for the subsequent possible need to go virtual, so going forward, the focus is on the plans, structures, connections, and policies to support the students, teachers, and parents. There has been an expansion in online schools, as well as in hybrid and blended learning. Dan and John feel it is still early in the process to say where we stand with generative AI. Schools must assist teachers with learning how to best leverage its use in the classroom while staying on top of AI-generated plagiarism. John and Dan share some on-the-ground insights on AI, which can help our listeners grow their understanding of where things stand. Personalized professional and personal learning are still critical for schools. One lesson learned from hosting the International Schools Podcast is to start your own podcast. It's a great way to share ideas, and with today's technology, it's not that difficult. It's important to decide what your focus will be, and as a host, you learn so much. Free PD, as John says. There are concerns about social media and how the algorithms continue to build on hate to lead to more divisive behaviors. However, on a constructive note, social media can help grow one's professional brand. There are also concerns about the ongoing teacher shortage, especially with the ever-growing number of international schools. Dan and John then reversed the course of the interview to ask us questions about the Educators Going Global podcast. We had fun comparing notes as podcasters. Check out the show notes for John's and Dan's bios. This episode was recorded on November 12th, 2023. We now give you the venerable host of the International Schools Podcast, Dan Taylor and John Mikton.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Educators Going Global. And let's start with Dan. Welcome to the show. And where in the world are you?
Hi, thank you very much. I'm just outside Prague in the Czech Republic in a small village called Uhaličky, just to the north, quite near the river of Prague, quite close to where John used to live at the International School of Prague.
Interesting. And how about you, John?
I'm in Nyon, Switzerland, and Nyon's in between Geneva and Lausanne, the two big kind of cities of the Swiss-French section of Switzerland on the lake.
Beautiful. Parlez-vous français?
Je parle français.
Ah, bravo.
I'm Swiss, so I would hope I could speak French.
Oh, yes. And probably German, too, I'm guessing.
French, not Schweizerdeutsch.
Uh-huh.
Well, I've tried to get John to do some training in German. It never works out, so I'm not sure about John's German. I need some evidence of it.
I cannot train in German.
Uh-huh. So normally we start with a going global story. How about we start with you, John? Have you got one for us?
Going global. Wow. When I was in the non-education sector, I had the opportunity with my wife. We did a bicycle trip around Asia and Eastern Europe and Europe. And while we were cycling through Thailand and Malaysia and Vietnam and Laos, one of Tracy's friends said that we could spend some time in Singapore. Her friend would let us house sit her house. So we went and house sat the house, and it was an apartment. And we were quite surprised because it was a 2-story apartment and there was a maid there and there was somebody at the door, and we're like, this is a teacher? It just seemed really odd, having just worked in San Francisco, and our only connection to public school was really maybe my in-law family's experience of public schools. And then the second time we came around, we met the lady. Her name is Miffy Greer, and she was the curriculum director for the Singapore American School. And she kind of told us about this whole international school thing. And we were like, wow, that's quite interesting. And then after our travels, we came back to California and we decided we both didn't want to continue in the business world. And at that time, the state of California was really trying to encourage people in industry to go into education. And there were all kind of programs. And we participated in a program at UCLA that basically gave grants and scholarships for people that were in industry to encourage them to go back to school and become educators. And I went into early years primary education, and I got a grant for being a male going into that area because there were not many. There were 90 women and myself in my program.
Wow.
And then while we were doing that, we worked at LA Unified, and one of our professors had been a superintendent many years ago in Japan at an international school. And he told us about that there's these fairs and blah, blah. So we, one February, flew up to San Francisco. It registered, I think it was ISS, and we interviewed with a bunch of different places. And a gentleman called Bill Powell interviewed you and offered us a job for going to Tanzania. And that's where we started our career.
Wow, that's awesome. It's interesting. Most people that we've talked to have this similar kind of organic story of learning about international schools and kind of falling into it. For me, it was different because I went to Queen's University, so the fair was right there. And
Oh, that's
our
right.
our teacher placement officer was really into the whole international school thing. So I kind of knew about it all along. So I just love hearing these stories of people just happening to find out about it. So how about you, Dan? Do you have a story for us?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, obviously I don't work for an international school. I work with international schools, and I have done for quite a few years. So when I left the UK, firstly, I went to the Netherlands. I was in enterprise IT. I worked for Deloitte, and I got a job in the Netherlands. And what was quite interesting about that job was they informed me once I got there, not before, that I actually had to work in Dutch. And I was like, okay, this wasn't, I thought it was going to be in English. So then I had to learn Dutch in 3 months, which was actually the best way ever to learn a language when you just have to learn it, So after 3 months, that was it. Everyone talked to me in Dutch. That was it. I sometimes spoke in English, but, I had to do it. I ended up coming to Prague after that. And then I kind of had enough of the business world. I wanted to get into education. I ended up working part-time. There's an Anglo-American college in Prague. It's a university and vocational college. I ended up working there in IT. And part-time, I set up Google there and helped set them up with Google. And I actually met John Mikton. John was actually the person I ended up getting started with. I ended up developing a tool at Anglo-American University, which was to automate creating Google sites for Google for classrooms. And then I ended up talking to John about it. John didn't need it, but he did need some training. So I ended up doing some training for him, which was great. And ended up full-time working with international schools on all kinds of things, but all pretty much Google-related stuff.
Oh, fantastic. And I'm envious that you get to travel around and spend so much time in among the international education community. It's just such a fantastic community.
Yeah, it's great. I'm quite lucky now. I've got a team I work with, so I don't have to travel all the time. And so I love it now when it's not every month, I'm traveling. And when I do it, I really like it.
So I'm going to jump in there with my connection to John. And Dan, I'm just meeting you, but I've followed you through your podcast. And so, John, I'm going to see if you can remember this. You were one of our early guests on the Shifting Our School podcast. So we had you on years ago. And then the second thing was I had this crazy idea back in the early 2000s to connect all the technology leaders in Asia. So I sent out a bunch of emails, and I got this email back from this guy in Japan named John Mikton, who said, hey, this is a great idea. I'm going to make a Ning to bring us all together to share ideas. And I said, what's a Ning? And so you taught me and you set it up. And I just thought it was a great way to network and bring in all that shared expertise. Do you have any memories of that Ning, John?
I do. And I'm just wondering what happened to Ning. It was so funny. Some of these things, that came up in the early 2000s, I would say from 2000 to 2007 and 8, before social media, a lot of us were trying different things. I know in the UK, they had Friendster, and there were just different ecosystems and how they have not continued. But Ning, I found, was such a great idea. I mean, it's really the precursor in some ways to LinkedIn in some ways.
Exactly. But that was a cool way to meet, and we've had a little correspondence over the years.
Yeah.
So let's jump into our big question. And Audrey and I, both as educational technologists, are really excited to have the two of you come in and share your expertise and kind of looking at the future. So here's the big question, and then we're going to unpack it with some smaller questions. So what does technology use in teaching and learning look like post-pandemic, and what might it look like going forward? So let's dive into that big question with this question of, well, everyone went virtual during the pandemic, and with your work coming in after the pandemic, what are some lessons learned from schools that went virtual, and what were some lessons that were non-technology, dealing maybe with staffing or planning or other areas of running international schools? Dan, why don't we start with you, and then we'll switch over to John.
John would probably have better answers than me. In some ways, it was like, from my point of view, like, this is what we've been telling you for like 5 years, like everything about going to the cloud and being able to communicate asynchronously and offline. In terms of how things have changed with technology, I mean, I always go the other way. You know what I'm seeing a lot of, and I don't know if John agrees with this and you guys agree, I've seen a lot of schools that seem to have almost forgotten about the pandemic already. And I think there's a real mixture. There's schools who have said, right, we need an emergency plan. We have to be able to switch to remote teaching, and we have to be able to go to hybrid or remote, and we'll practice certain days in the year. Like I was just in a couple of schools in Singapore, UWC, they have certain days when the kids are on campus, but they even will work via Google Meet and everything. And then some schools that are just like, okay, Google gave away some free features during the pandemic, now they don't need them. And so I don't know, I'm worried that if it happens again, there'll be still 50% of schools not having changed too much. But I think it's definitely hastening the move to the cloud as well. I think schools are moving away from the physical servers, and they want something they can maintain virtually as well.
All right, John, what's your take?
No, I think Dan's observation is very accurate. I'm actually sometimes surprised that after the pandemic, there still seems to be some resistance in some schools that are saying that was the pandemic and now we're going back to the old way. And I know during the pandemic, there were a lot of communities and groups getting together, how we're going to change school. We're going to look at school through a different lens. We're going to think of learning out of the box. But all those conversations don't seem to have come to much fruition at a large scale. I'm sure in different parts of the world, there are things that have changed. I think the side effect is the well-being. I don't think we're still over that. And I think schools have had mixed results in addressing it. And I think for some teachers, they are just happy to have less tech, because I think for some it was quite challenging and it was quite full on. If you think of some situations in public schools, or even I know in some schools where people had to be on 8 hours. The school philosophy was, we're replicating the calendar and the day, and you're going to be on from 8 to whatever the end day was. And I think there was a lot of emotional and mental burnout. And I don't think it was ever addressed, or it was addressed piecemeal. And I think it's kind of the afterflow. I think people are still trying to digest that and come to terms, especially if you're doing that alone. I know how challenging it was for our single staff members when I was managing the COVID response with a team of school leaders. And I think that one, we still have a lot of work to do. And I think it has a bit of a domino effect on other things, where maybe people now are maybe not resistant, but more apprehensive, or like, yeah, I don't want to be in front of a screen again. It reminds me of all my time on COVID.
Yeah.
One thing that I think, and Dan brought it up, is there has been a move to cloud. I think also it forced many people that Dan and his team had been saying, you need to learn these tools. These are really important. And suddenly they were forced to. So I remember for our digital learning coaches on our podcast, we had some coaches come on and they said that was kind of the silver lining. A lot of people moved to online tools, were using LMSs or whatever it might be, a seesaw portfolio type of vehicle. And everybody was engaged and had dabbled into it. Are they continuing with it? That, I think it depends. It's kind of mixed results.
I'm wondering, with the focus on the well-being now, the positive that's come from this disruption, and I think this is what you're saying, is that we'll circle around and look back at the technology and say, we need to use this in a very meaningful way that builds community, connects people, but does not decrease focus, does not add to distraction. Then it gets all to the citizenship, I guess we call it digital citizenship, and that digital wellness, which should be on everyone's plates. It should be a prime mover in all schools, if you ask me.
Yep.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you really struck a chord there when you were talking about schools that went full on in real time schedule, 8 hours a day, et cetera. And that was me. And it was such a challenge. And I'm hearing about other models, the other ways other schools are doing it. Really, I think there were certainly a variety of ways to do it. But if you had full control, if all the schools were connected and you were in charge of technology, how would you help schools prepare for the next potential virtual lockdown or whatever might cause something? How can we do better? Let's start with Dan.
I think the technology piece is the easiest part of it. I think everyone now knows, obviously, Google, Microsoft, and they've all got good online teaching tools. You could use Zoom as well. There's plenty of tools to do it. So I don't think the technology is the issue. I think for most schools, that kind of should be already there. I think, like John said, the piece is just schools they haven't got a plan to move to a different way of learning. Like you said, having a full timetable of regular teaching is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for the children. I think the mental health impact on the children is maybe even more than on the staff. So I think that would be the issue. And John, I always know what my areas of expertise are. I definitely defer to John on this. He would know a lot more than me about it.
I agree with Dan. I think the tech is the easiest part. And as Dan rightly said, the tools are there. I think it's hard to say there's one size that fits all because you have, first of all, the expectation of the parents, you have the expectation of the school, the expectation of the students, and the expectation of the staff. So you really can't say this is the template that we all need to use. Everybody's going to be different. One thing that I discovered during the pandemic was Michael Moore's work at the University of Pennsylvania, on transactional distance theory. And he did a lot of studies in the 90s about when you have a distance between the person delivering the learning and the recipient, and that distance is large, there are certain factors that have to come in to be more impactful. And he talks about three things. One is dialogue. You need to have a lot of dialogue. And we're talking about an online environment. So you need to engage people in dialogue. That could be chat, quick drop-ins. It could even be a Google form and then some chatting. And the second one is structure. Structure is not only the hardware and the digital ecosystems, but structure in the way you teach. What are the learning outcomes? What are the learning objectives? Do you have a structure that's very clear and very transparent and is easy for a learner independently to follow those steps? And the last one is learning autonomy. How much autonomy you create, where kids can create projects, they have input, and it's more than just filling in worksheets or downloading PDFs and then completing it and sending it back. So he talks about those three areas, the idea of dialogue, structure, not only in hardware structure, but curriculum structure and learning structure, and then the idea of learner autonomy, how much collaboration and how much free space there is for students to have agency in the online environment. And I think that's maybe something that, as schools revisit or are considering to really amplify what they're doing, I think many schools have realized that and are re-looking at the way that what is delivered in the classroom can't be carbon copied to be delivered in the online world. But what that might look like might be very different depending on the curriculum. But there's no doubt that balance of having some autonomy, having clarity, make it vanilla. If every teacher designs their own special way of doing things, a kid that has 8, 9, 10 different teachers to interact with, that's a nightmare. Because every time it's a brand new map that they have to understand. So what can you make it to be vanilla? And, vanilla might not be as interesting, but it's at least very stable and easy to attain. Really, at the end of the day, you don't want your kids getting lost in trying to work out how to learn. You want them to be learning. And so often I think we forget that design metric is so important.
Yeah, I've just got one additional thing to add, if I could. Another trend, something I thought of while John was talking, a big macro trend I have seen is the number of online international schools is huge now. And it was very much a niche thing before the pandemic. There was a couple I'd heard of. Now I see them all the time popping up. And it's an interesting trend. I think a lot of parents have just said, look, this is we'll just let the children work online. I think some people, parents maybe want to do a bit more of a digital nomad lifestyle, travel to different places, let their children teach. And I think the pandemic showed it was possible, even if it wasn't ideal. And that's a trend I never would have expected. And it's interesting because there's kind of a blended effect I've seen. Some kids, they go into an international school, but maybe they don't have like a Chinese option in there. So they'll take Chinese classes from an international school. And that's something that's becoming a big trend, I think. And some schools are even incorporating an option to take online classes from online providers with their regular curriculum, which I think is fascinating.
I'm smiling here and changing the questions because you guys are so cutting edge. You're answering my questions before I ask them. Because I was just about to ask if you're seeing some blended learning. That's a big takeaway, I would think. And the whole idea of maybe some schools that are offering virtual versions of their program, especially if they're trying to brand themselves and it becomes a very commercial thing. It reminds me when I was back at HKIS back in the early 2000s, David Elliott and Francis Thong, the whole idea that this is right after we had SARS and virtual school. We said, why don't we set up an HKIS virtual school for people who don't live in Hong Kong, who want that brand experience, and a bunch of creative instructional technologies. I think it was a great idea. And it's what happened here. We had this big disruption. So it will be interesting with so many commercial entities coming into this space and what they come up with. One, to make a profit, but two, to serve a population. So I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, it is. I was looking at, Harrow, obviously the famous English independent school, they have an online program, and cost is similar to sending your children to a regular international school just to do the online A-levels through Harrow. It's not any different. So, they're definitely, from an entrepreneur's point of view, it's a big business. And they're all for profit, these schools. I haven't heard of one that isn't for profit, the online schools.
So lots of interesting changes on the horizon and already happening. Where do we stand with the use of what's on the tip of everybody's tongue is generative AI in schools? And what do you see regional organizations and schools doing to address that elephant in the room? Why don't we start with John?
Well, I think regions, one, ERCOS just had a big meeting in, I think they were in the Philippines this time around. And I know I was involved with the Department of Overseas Schools in Washington. I facilitated a retreat with 12 IT directors and principals, and they came out with a white paper. And a big section of that was about generative AI and how we're going to leverage that. I think schools understand it's something that has to be dealt with. I think, again, you have different schools reacting differently. I definitely see real effort to become familiar and make sure that there's professional learning associated with that. Just the other day, I have ChatGPT 4, and I just created my personalized assistant for makerspace activities. So now you can actually have a personalized assistant for different areas of expertise that then only interacts with you and keeps that information, and then you can create lessons. So I think it is going to transform. But as with many things, I think sometimes we are complacent as schools. And the problem is, where do you fit this in? You've got assessment, you've got this and that, and there's never enough time. But personally, I think this is going to be much more of a disruptor than we anticipate, especially because you're seeing it happen so fast. And now, there are, I don't know how many hundreds of AI apps based on ChatGPT architecture that are showing up. You have Magic School Bus, you have EduEye, you just name them, they just keep popping up. So I think really the only question schools should be asking, in my personal opinion, is what is the value-added proposition of school now that we have generative AI in the classroom? And I think that is the introspection and the thinking that schools have to do, is really, what do we bring to the table that ChatGPT 4 doesn't?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I love that you're kind of flipping it around from how can we use it to how can we keep up with it, kind of.
Yeah. I think that nobody has got a clue about it. And everyone's doing a lot of talking. And it's great because it's not anybody's fault they don't have a clue, because it's a completely new paradigm and a new, whatever era of computing we're in, after Web3, like the era 4 or something. But I think there's a few discussions. John and me are part of some groups where people are really knowledgeable about ChatGPT 4 and the various applications. I think we've got to look back in a year to see where this goes. I think that it's changing so rapidly. The only area it's for sure impacted education, and I don't think people are talking about this to the extent they should, it is just in plagiarism. I mentioned before to John, my godson and his friend, they're in an international school, and they were staying with us recently, and they just said they were using it to write everything. All their papers, everything, all their IBDP stuff. It was all, they were just using ChatGPT. And kids are smarter than you give them credit for. They'd figured out how to get around the Turnitin check or Google Originality Reports check. They can switch things a bit. They can self-check it and then do it again. So I think we're in a golden era of student cheating. I think I said that before to John. I don't think it's going to last very long. So that's the main thing I see right now with ChatGPT. I mean, if you look at software systems, everyone says, we're using AI, but it's kind of like it's a little bit of snake oil in some ways. Obviously, machine learning has been a part of systems for a long time. Now it's ChatGPT, it's become a big thing. So I just don't know. I like to talk knowledgeably when I know something about this. And right now, even though I'm trying to keep up with it, I just think it's going to take a year or two to see how it's going to impact education. I'm curious what you guys think as well.
Well, I think we should put a prompt into ChatGPT all about this to ask that question.
Exactly.
Oh, that's good. We had on a head of school or previous head of school, and he was giving advice. We were talking mainly about teaching in Africa and what it would mean to go and become head of a school in Africa. And what he said was the first rule is to say you know nothing coming in and just get ready to learn. So I think that very much connects to what you're saying, Dan. And yeah. I feel a little better that organizations are reaching out to the two of you to at least say, okay, let's get the dialogue going and see what percolates. Because as we know, one of the dangers here for schools is to put up on their websites, we're a generative AI school and check the box. And the parents think that's what is the latest buzzword. So that's going to be good for my kids, but without really getting into the responsibility that goes with it and how to leverage this tool for the good, not the cheating per se, as you said, Dan.
Yeah.
You all had our old buddy Jeff Udick on several episodes ago talking about a lot of his big ideas. And one of them was professional learning, which is what his outfit does and what you're doing, Dan. So let's move into professional learning a little bit. And one of the topics that he brought up, and it's one that he and I used to talk a lot about on the Shifting Our Schools podcast, was personalizing personal and professional learning to really individualize it as much as possible to give people agency in designing how they learn and such. So, Dan, why don't we start with you and just what's happening in your world of professional learning as you go out and work with school populations?
Yeah, this is a question I would definitely defer to John on more. I'm not an expert in this. I mean, obviously differentiation isn't a new concept in education. It's something that's always been done. I think I would actually like to defer to John on this because I think he's got a lot more valuable opinions than me.
Well, Dan, you're very generous, but I think you do such great work with your team.
That's right.
The work that you guys are doing, supporting teachers in different schools and the services. And Dan runs a fantastic newsletter called Google Technical Community, and I know a lot of people appreciate it. It's where different experts, they're just, in other words, experts in their craft. They're educators, tech directors, coaches that come into a forum, and Dan facilitates that, and they can ask questions and things like that. That, to me, is an example of personalized learning that we see much more of. Organizations like Dan's are definitely creating platforms where you can go in and ask a question like, this doesn't work, could you help me? And I think, Dan, you have to give yourself much more credit because I know so many people appreciate the resources that you put out and just creating that platform. I know that our previous sponsor, Faria, also has a Discord and they do the same thing. I think you're seeing more communities where instead of just sharing, it's actually troubleshooting together. I know we're about to interview Brian Lockwood Garland and Wolfgang, and they have an organization, Tech Director Talk, and it's again another venue where you can get a really like I'm trying to connect my manage back with my finance system. What might be an API that I can work with? So those kind of things, I think you see many more, and they're extremely helpful because so often as international school educators, we're somewhat isolated. We might not have that community in our geographic location. So I think those platforms have become really quite rich. And I think it's the same. You see great Facebook groups on PYP, MYP, and DP. I think you're seeing, a Knowledge Works calls that civic superpowers. It's the idea that a small group of people leveraging algorithms and social media can gain a lot of traction and an audience and then help each other. And I think that's what we're seeing much more is people just saying, you know what, I can't get the answer, so I'm starting a group and we're going to try to work out the answers together.
Yeah.
Like outsourcing your just-in-time learning. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you guys are podcasting veterans. You've recorded well over 100 episodes of the International Schools podcast. What are some of your biggest takeaways from interviewing so many guests? Would you like to share? Maybe, Dan, you could start.
Yeah, I would say number one, if you are an educator or someone working for a school, looking at, building up your profile, then it's very easy to get on podcasts. And this is something I don't think people realize. I think people listen to John and my podcast and think, they have to be us. But we don't get many educators asking us to be on the podcast. And if they do, we almost always say yes, because most of them have something interesting to say, pretty much all of them, Most of the things we get pitched on are by companies. There's a lot of podcast. I don't know if you guys get the same, Audrey and David, where like a lot of podcast agencies saying, we can. Sorry, Joe.
We are not at your level, so we only get a little bit of those companies reaching out to us.
Yeah, but you know what? It's interesting, and even we occasionally let them on if it's edtech related, and if they're gonna not pitch their products, and it's just they've got something to say. But very few educators contact us. And if I was an educator, for people listening to this, just contact the podcast, contact John and me, contact you two. I'm sure even if it's a no, which it probably won't be, then you'll get some feedback as to what you were doing. So that's one thing I've learned. It's very easy to do it. I would say if you want to do a podcast as well, I think it's a great thing to do. I don't know what you guys experience, but John and me, we never. I mean, I started this by myself, and fortunately for me, John got involved and gave it a lease of life. He's a lot more professional, a lot more organized than I am with it. But I think that if you want to do a podcast, I would say just do one. But I would say, and my advice is, don't think about who's going to listen to it. Don't try to be general. Just focus on one thing. Like John mentioned with the communities now, we have a very focused Google community. It's not even Google, it's Google administration and technical topics. I'd think do a podcast on, your subject area and something very, very specific. And no education podcast is going to become like Joe Rogan, and get like millions of listens. But it's like
Why not?
Well, you guys have got a good chance, but the rest of us, it's not going to happen.
Thank you.
So I think that just a niche thing is good. And I think if you are going to do a podcast, just do it. Don't in the beginning it was very basic how we did it. We didn't do any editing. I just recorded it and uploaded it. Things we've learned, I mean, I'm not sure. John might have some more feedback. I don't think we've learned much on the technical side, apart from, we've had technical issues like today. My mic is coming through too quiet. We can't identify why. There's no reason. You always have technical issues. We pretty much still release the episode anyway, even if it's not perfect. Podcasting isn't like a TV show. It doesn't have to be a certain length of time. It doesn't have to be a certain format. You can just let the conversation flow. And I think the best episodes we've done are where we've just let the conversation go, and it's just, it hasn't, we've kind of thrown away the format and just talked. I think they've been the best ones.
Well, we're not quite there yet. Maybe at some point we'll get there, but we do like to have a bit of structure. So now I'll pass it over to you, John, with with my structure.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Dan's point's a good one. It's amazing the educators out there and the stories. We bring people on and then we start digging and we're like, wow, what a great story. And, one thing that we've noticed is there are a lot of educators that become entrepreneurs, and that's always interesting.
Yeah.
To see how they have reflected on their practice as an educator and then decided they want to amplify that, but at a larger scale, and then start a company or an organization. That's been really rich. I find, as I always tell people, I get free PD every 2 weeks because I sit and talk to these people and I learn. I walk away and I'm always like, oh, I better go and check that. So for me, I'm very selfish. It's my free PD. And I can ask all the questions that usually when, you have a keynote or a workshop facilitator and there are 100 of you in the room, you can never really interact with them. But Dan and I get somebody in the room and we just get to drill them with questions. And what's great is we walk away and we're like, wow, I never thought of that, or I never realized that, or I've just learned something. Yeah. So I feel very fortunate to be working with Dan and doing that. I think, people really mean well. People are kind. They really want to make the world a better place. I just think so often we forget that it doesn't have to be something cataclysmic. It can be just a little gesture. And I feel always humbled by the people that come on the podcast and share their challenges, their journeys, their whatever it might be. And it's always very humbling to realize that at the end of the day, we're just good people, generally human beings. It's just that sometimes a lot of stuff gets in the way and we lose focus. But I definitely feel that it's been a very positive thing to talk to so many educators because there is a common denominator that people want to do good for kids and they really have their heart in the right place in the schools that they are and the leaders and the educators that we talk with.
Well, it's true. And the connections and the personal stories really fill the soul, don't they?
Yes.
For me, I started this podcast just because I'm a massive consumer of podcasts. I listen to podcasts. I don't really watch TV anymore. My TV consumption is with my wife watching Netflix in bed on the laptop when we're exhausted at the end of the day. I never watch TV anymore. And I don't watch that many. I don't really have time to watch films anymore, but I listen to podcasts all the time if I'm driving, if I'm on public transport, if I'm doing some exercise. So I think people underestimate what a huge thing it is, and I'm sure, guys, even though, your podcast and ours, it's not a massive audience on the global scale, you'll still get people who you'll impact, even with a small podcast. So I think that's great.
And between our two podcasts, and there are a couple others out there focusing on international education, that we talk about how big the world is, but how small the world is of international education, because so many of us have crossed paths. And now we live in this world, John, and going back to the early days of ed tech, the handful of mainly men who were traveling the world and teaching us about educational technology. And now we've got maybe the third generation from then, these young teachers who, just like you say, they've got their content area and they're able to hang their digital shingle up and make a difference and brand themselves too. I remember when Kim Cafino and Jeff were talking about that like a decade ago. How are you branding yourself as part of the recruiting process? So that's a big deal. As we wind down here, we're going to ask that you look into your crystal balls of looking out maybe, let's say, the next 3-5 years on what you think might be happening in international education. And Dan, we're not going to put you on the spot there because you're involved in international education. So maybe in your field, in what's happening with the Google platform and just how you might be delivering services. But why don't we start with John, taking a look in that crystal ball, John?
It's always hard to look in the crystal ball. I definitely am concerned. I have some serious concerns regarding information literacy and media literacy, especially with deep fakes coming in and some of the issues with equity, injustice, and diversity with AI. I think some of those topics, again, are kind of being brushed over, but I don't think we realize the importance of not only kids, but schools taking the time to give professional development and letting teachers understand what does deepfake mean? What is a deepfake picture? What is a fake story? How do you teach that to a group of kids that are inundated with social media stories that often are inaccurate? And I feel that we're somewhat, and I'm sure I'll get shot at Don for saying this, but I just feel we're very complacent as schools. And we are not taking the time and not making that a priority. And, we kind of ignored social media. And now we understand there are all kinds of things about social media that we regret we had been more engaged with. And we're seeing different issues for mental health for different cohorts and groups. So for me, with the advent of AI and not knowing what's going to happen, I think we really need to be far more proactive and far more concrete and carving the time out to really get teachers, give them the professional development so they can navigate media literacy in a time of generative AI. Because I think if we believe, as our missions do, in equality and multiple voices and global learners that are caring for peace, well, if we ignore this, then we're going to end up with something that we really don't want. And that, I think in some ways this is about free will, and if we don't engage with it as schools and as educators, it's going to come around to a point where we'll be like, ooh, what happened? That just disappeared. So I think media and information literacy and understanding the impact of racism and gender inequality in AI are two things that I would really think are going to be really critical. And I'm just hoping schools are brave enough to say, okay, we need to make this a priority. We might drop off some other things. And that's what my hope. And I'm not sure that's going to happen, but maybe somebody can disagree with me and say it's happening. I think it's happening in little pockets, but I don't think there's a collective awareness of the impact of media and information literacy in the age of AI and deepfakes.
Yes, and the key word there is bravery. And we can only hope, and through our connected world, that many voices will come together and say in our schools, this is what we need to start talking about, and we need to start putting plans together to expand the skill set for our students, just as you said.
But Dave, we have to first start with the teachers, because I think
Yeah.
we need to understand none of us in our teaching colleges or universities or certification courses ever had a topic called generative AI and deep fakes and fake news. So we can't make the assumption that teachers have those skills. We really need to understand teachers need to be supported. We need to do deep, thoughtful PD around those topics. So then they're better equipped and they don't feel disenfranchised when kids come and tell them these stories about this news, or they're doing a PYP exhibit and half the stuff they're generating and finding online is inaccurate. I think that's unfair to put teachers in that situation. We need to first start with the teachers.
Oh, yeah, I'm agreeing with you. And I think you just said something important there. Let's start in our teaching universities, getting our teachers ready and trained as best they can. And then, as you're saying, they come into their schools that already have the programs in place and the structures and systems to then support them. So that makes total sense. Dan, what about you and your crystal ball?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, first of all, great points, and good, David and John. I agree with both of what you just said. I think to add on the social media, I think the other big issue is just learning that. I'm very negative on social media right now. I go through phases. Right now, I'm an unbelievably negative. I don't think it's possible to have a civil discussion with people on social media. I think the algorithm reinforces your prejudices, and you just shout at someone else and they shout at you. So that's a whole different topic we could get into. But I think that's my additional thing on social media. I've got completely different points to John in terms of my crystal ball. One, I think the people are realizing the importance of having a personal brand for yourself in your career is massive. And I think a lot of educators don't do it because they don't want to be accused of someone saying, oh, that person's being a salesman or saleswoman, or they're promoting themselves. And here's the thing, people will say that, but so what? The alternative is nobody knows about you. So I think that now building that profile and getting yourself out there as a way of building your career, I think it's becoming mainstream. There's obviously ways that you can learn from how people like John does it to the right way, but I think that's becoming huge. I think, building that network of real people via, I don't like the term personal brand, but I don't know what a better term is huge. I'm really lucky that I get to visit a lot of schools. I was just in Singapore and Thailand. I was in the Middle East. I go all over Europe. And the big trend I'm seeing is people are talking about the upcoming teacher shortage and educator shortage. And I think it is going to be a big issue people haven't really focused on. Schools are going to have an issue recruiting. There's a huge explosion of a number of international schools. We had some guests talk about it. 80 to 90% of international schools now are for-profit businesses. It's like John mentioned before, I think, the golden days of international school packages are going down. People are not getting the really good deals they did where they'd get 3 children's education and they'd get teacher holidays and they'd get flights home and they'd get a really nice place paid for. I think it's getting tougher. The question is, will this teacher shortage turn things the other way? And schools are going to have to start offering really good deals again because, the reality is you could make more money in a business, like I'm sure we all could make more money doing something outside of education. So will schools start offering better packages when this teacher shortage, because the teacher shortage hasn't hit now, but it is going to hit. And people are talking about it, but a lot of people are still kind of ignoring it. So that's kind of my thing. And then the online education, which we talked about earlier, I think that's going to be, you can see the explosion, and that's only going to increase.
I think you're totally right. We've definitely started, I think, to see the beginning of that teacher shortage happening. I mean, I'm registered on a couple of the different recruiting agencies, and I've been getting emails every day about jobs that are still not filled. So I think it's definitely started. And we had Lloyd French on from Teachaway, and he's researched this somewhat and, basically taken the number of schools that are out there and the positions that are going to be needed to be filled, and then the number of teacher candidates coming up, and it's it's a negative balance. So you're totally right there. So I get to ask the fun question, since you guys like to go off script. What else would you like to talk about that we didn't talk about yet? And maybe we'll let you start, Dan.
I would like to find out, how's this podcast going? I've listened to one episode, so I'm going to be honest with you. I listened to one, which I guess is still good. I still have listened to an episode. What do you see? How's it going? Is it harder than you thought? Are you? Is it more of a workload than you thought? Are you starting to get feedback? I mean, we didn't get any feedback for a lot of episodes, and so we were kind of shouting into the dark. Are you starting to get feedback? And how's it going?
Audrey, why don't you go over how we are a bigger thing than just the podcast, your original vision and our mission?
Sure. So the original idea was to create an information hub where teachers, particularly teachers who were new to the idea of international education, but also veterans, could come and learn about what it is, how to do it, etc. And then that's for the newbies. And then for the vets, it was all about what's going on, what's new, current trends and things like that. And then also transitioning, because even veterans probably could use some tips on transitioning. So mostly the idea was to try to drive traffic to the website. And the thinking was, let's have a bunch of episodes already recorded and have those on the website. It's not meant to be a serial podcast. It's meant to be a resource. So we have a resource library where people can go and find different sources of information. We have a podcast page where all our podcasts are listed and people can search them up by topic. We have a blog page where David has done pretty much all the writing, and that's got a variety of topics. So if someone goes to our site and searches, say, recruiting, there will be blog posts that come up, there will be resources that come up, and there will be podcasts that come up.
Yep.
And so it's meant to be a place to get all the information together. So that was the original vision. And as far as how it's going, it's so much fun because we want to build an audience, but we're not so focused on that. We're mostly focused on the connections that we're making. As John said, we learn from our interviewees every single time, which is so much fun, and making new connections, but also reconnecting with old friends and digging into their stories is wonderful. And we hope that we're providing a service for both new and veteran international teachers. David, what do you want to add to that?
I'll just add on the technical side, I've mentioned the Shifting Our School podcast that Jeff and I started back 2007, 2008. And then I was on one called the EdTech Co-op. And it was so difficult because the tools weren't there. And so that made it really rough. But like you said earlier, Dan, anyone can start producing a podcast now. It's just so much easier.
Yeah.
So that on the technical side. And then back to the mission, we are truly mission driven. We just want to help people and have these rich conversations. And you all model, you are the leader in this field when it comes to international education. And you all set a high standard. So we're trying to live up to what you two guys are doing. So thanks.
I don't know about that, but thank you.
I'm not sure. You might want to, that's very kind. But I know that Dan and I, often people will say that. And we're like, are you sure this is the right podcast you're talking about?
Yeah.
And, what's interesting, and I really appreciate hearing both of you, is that you've created a mission and you have a real clear focus. And I think that's, and Dan alluded to that too, when you start your podcast, pick something that you're passionate about and be focused on that. Making it too broad, then not that I think we're all trying to compete against the Rogans and whatever it might be, but I think definitely your mission and the way you described it, it makes so much sense. And when I listen to your episodes, it really amplifies that mission. So hats off to both of you.
Thank you. John, what else do you want to talk about that we haven't talked about yet?
I'm just curious, what are you, when you get your guests, how are you picking your guests and what is happening? What are you noticing as you engage with them? Because you have, going through some of your podcasts, you have your mission. And so people fall into a category that maybe amplifies the mission. Just curious, how are you getting your guests and what are you learning from them?
So I'll start us on this one. So we are reaching out to our network, and because we've taught in so many schools and worked with so many people, we have a lot of connections. So that aspect of it, we still have a lot of people that we can draw on. The other part of it, though, is that a year ago when Audrey came up with this idea, we just brainstormed, and we have like 25 more topics just sitting there on a list. But then when we talk to you guys, it gives me 2 more ideas for other shows. And that's the wonder of, I guess, lateral thinking, as we call it. So that's kind of how we get people. And then, like we shared pre-recording, we're pretty structured. We have a guiding question. And I think our shows are very focused. Yet there are times when we can go off laterally and see where it takes us as well. But the bottom line is that we're getting on wonderful people at all different levels and all different roles within the international school ecosystem. And I think hopefully that's painting the picture for the new folks and the veterans. And the biggest change is just the number of schools, as Dan was saying, and the growth of the for-profit. So that's a whole realm of trying to figure that out with our guest and providing good information. So thanks to both of you, being the podcasters you are, to ask us about how we're doing. So thanks.
Well, no, it's good. You know what I think is good about you guys is you're different to us in the sense of you're very intentional. Your podcast is focused on helping people who want to become international educators or want to advance their career. I mean, even though earlier I gave the advice that you should do a niche area focused on something, which is the best way to podcast. Like we didn't do that. Our podcast has no agenda. I own a business, but I don't promote that on the podcast. There is no agenda to our podcast. It's purely people we're interested to talk to. It's gone in different directions. It used to be pretty much technology. Now John's interested in a lot of new topics that I'm kind of being exposed to. So there's all kinds of ways you can do a podcast. I think that's interesting. I think you guys are doing it in a very intelligent way. I don't think we did. I think if you keep going long enough, we've done 100 episodes plus, 110 now maybe. I think if you keep going, it eventually sort of starts to find a bit of a rhythm at a certain point.
Yeah, I think that rhythm is a really important one thing. We have been is very religious about making sure every 2 weeks we have that podcast.
Yeah.
And so what often we do, we just released one today with Ken Shelton that did a great job on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in schools and the work that he's done. But we recorded it. It's funny because it's released now and it's cold, but it was 37 degrees in Switzerland when we released it. So one thing we do, and I'm wondering if you do the same, we tend not to interview the guests the week before we release. We basically create a bank because just with guests and timing, and Dan travels a lot, we found that it's good to have a bank of recordings ahead of time. So that's just something that we've learned is being consistent. And through that consistency, we've really developed an audience, not by us going and knocking on doors, just people bumping into it and then sharing it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
Do you guys record ahead of time and then have a bank of recordings, or do you do it every week?
We record ahead of time. In fact, this one will probably come out in a couple of months because we have a bunch queued up that have been edited or need to be edited.
Yeah.
And we also, David was talking about our brainstorming. We have a whole spreadsheet of topics, but also we have, probably at least 30 more guests that we really want to try to get on the show. And it's hard to see this slowing down at all because new guests bring in new ideas and then we're always adding to the list.
Yeah.
And really, it's exciting for me because I'm learning, as you guys said, and it's so much fun to do, especially the meeting people part I just love. So we really appreciate that you guys came on the show and want to thank you so much for taking the time. We know how busy everybody always is. Maybe you can just give us a quick note on how people can follow you if they want to learn more about technology and international education in general.
I would say, for me, just search for Dan Taylor. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so get in touch on LinkedIn. I hate Twitter and Facebook nowadays. I'm very negative about it. But I'm there. You can contact me on there as well. I know John makes the most out of Facebook with his excellent community, but I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very active there, so please send me a message, connect with me, send me a message. It'd be great.
Yeah, I would echo what Dan says. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's where I like to interact with people. And also we have a International Schools Podcast LinkedIn group. And so you can always connect there if you're interested in sharing a story or something. We'd love to hear from you. And so LinkedIn too. I do have a Facebook group, but I really stopped using Facebook on a personal level. But for the group, it's quite active and a lot of great sharing, a lot of great resources that people generously share every week or day. So that's another place you can always reach out to me.
Fantastic. And this has been fun at the end, going off script a little bit. And so I'm just going to say thank you so much for taking some time on your weekend, guys. And that's a wrap.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.